with a bit better understanding, we're going to recap some things about the Pendleton Civil Service Act. After the Pendleton Civil Service Act, we do have the nonpartisan meritocratic system that is still used today. So merit, again, means we're picking people for the civil service. We're promoting them within the civil service based on their merit, their qualifications, and their ability, and how well they do the job. Not based on their politics, or not based on whether they maybe gave money to a political campaign. This also includes, for some higher positions, some specialized positions, specialization is important within the bureaucracy, that some hires for the civil service must pass competitive exams in order to get their jobs. One of the results of this is that there is now less corruption. We're not going to get to zero. No country has zero corruption in its politics or its bureaucracy, but less corruption and a higher quality civil service. There is a bit of a downside in this case, is an unintended consequence that you saw in the CNBC video. As a result of the switch from a patronage to a merit-based system, businesses and special interests still wanted to get their influence in the government. And now that they don't have these patronage networks as a way to achieve that, and it's also, there's also a supply side. Politicians want to be able to, I don't want to make this sound too grimy, but sell their influence within the system. Because of that kind of unsatisfied need on both sides, with the loss of patronage came the opportunity for money from businesses and special interests to become a bigger player in American politics, especially at the federal level. And I know that all sounds kind of confusing, so I just kind of try to recap that in a shorter, more distilled version. When patronage no longer allows politicians to achieve support from people in exchange for jobs, politicians now seek support from other sources, and that support comes from businesses and special interests in the form of money. And so that was kind of the unintended consequence of the Pendleton Civil Service Act. But back to the people of the bureaucracy, we have the Hatch Act of 1939, and this is all about ensuring that the civil service is apolitical. And for civil service jobs in general, there's to be no politics on duty. You're not to express your political views. You're not to campaign, not to raise funds. For some higher positions in the civil service, there is no politics, period. Hence the bold and underlined period. Not on duty, not off duty. They are seen as having jobs of sufficient importance that they have to be seen as apolitical on and off the job. Civil servants, while civil servants cannot run for office, is part of this. And in addition to no politics on duty, not only can they not fundraise on the job, they are also not allowed to fundraise even off duty. So, and that is, the Hatch Act is important and remains important to this day. The third part of our nonpartisan meritocratic system for filling the civil service is that hiring is done by the Office of Personnel Management, the OPM, based on standards, impersonal standards for the jobs. Promotion is also done as much as possible as can be in an impersonal fashion, based on how long someone has been in the job, their qualifications, their work history, and the system for promotion, determining promotions, is called the general schedule. And we talk about general scheduling ratings. These run from government general scheduling 1 up to 18, 18 being the top. Now, I do want you to be careful, because you will see driving around in life at some point, or just walking down a busy city sidewalk outside of a government building, you will see license plates that have G's on them. This does not indicate that the person who is driving that vehicle is a G13. It certainly can't mean that the person driving the vehicle is a G62. It does not exist. Those numbers mean something else. But in the general scheduling rating system, GS18 is the top. And these people are very powerful within the bureaucracy. They often have wide-ranging experience. And these are the people who, despite talking about bureaucracies as specialized organizations, these people are seen as having leadership skills that are widely applicable, and they may be moved from one part of the federal government to another, because management is their thing. Another element of the nonpartisan meritocracy is protection from firing for politics. Officials can be fired for cause, meaning that they've done something improper, especially improper on the job, failed to do their job, some other malfeasance. Those are reasons that they can be fired. This is criticized for providing protection for incompetent bureaucrats. As long as somebody is still showing up and doing their job, even if they're not particularly good at it, it is difficult to fire people from the bureaucracy. And so that is one of the major sources of criticism, is that once an incompetent person is able to get themselves into the civil service, it can be quite difficult to get them out. Whereas in the private sector, with at-will hiring and firing, getting rid of somebody that the organization views as incompetent is usually quite easy. In the topic of protection from political firing, we do also have a relevant and highly topical Supreme Court case, and that is Humphreys, Executor versus United States, a case that was from 1935. And in this case, the primary takeaway for students is the Supreme Court ruled that for an independent executive agency, in this case, the Federal Trade Commission, and this is certainly one of those cases where you must write down more than what is on the slide, what is on in front of you on the screen. The Supreme Court ruled that in the case of someone working within an independent executive agency, presidents were not permitted to fire based on political or policy grounds. So again, in the case of an independent executive agency, the government or the president could not fire a civil servant based on politics or policy disagreements. The only reason a civil servant could be fired was for cause. It's for some of the more of the details of the case to kind of illustrate the Supreme Court's decision. Man named Humphrey, last name Humphrey, had been appointed by President Hoover as a commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission. That is one of those independent executive agencies, one of those regulatory commissions. He was confirmed by the Senate. He's still in the job in 1933 when Franklin Roosevelt, is inaugurated, and President Roosevelt asks Humphrey to resign because Humphrey, appointed by Hoover, was politically conservative and might, through the bureaucracy, work against Roosevelt's New Deal policies. Humphrey refuses to resign, and Roosevelt responds by firing him from the FTC. The act that created the FTC, however, built into the legislation the protection from political firing. The FTC Act said that somebody had to do something like be neglectful of their duty or guilty of malfeasance in their position. The reason it's called Humphrey's executor is Humphrey died. And so his executor of his estate carried the case before the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court ruled, again, in case you didn't write it the first couple of times I said it, is that in this case, with the Independent Regulatory Commission, an independent executive agency, the president did not have what the Supreme Court called an illimitable power of removal. Because of the way the commission was created by Congress, and the statute that created it said political firing was not permissible, the president could not just fire this person working with within the executive branch based on their politics or policy disagreements. You could only fire for cause. Now, the reason I'm making such a big deal out of this is because Humphrey's executor versus the United States is likely to be an important precedent that is going to be considered before the Supreme Court in cases about the Trump administration's firing of different civil servants within the executive branch bureaucracy. And so, as a precedent, Humphrey's executor might lead the Supreme Court to reinstate the people who had been fired and say that those firings were illegal or unconstitutional. On the other hand, the Supreme Court might do what it has lately been more inclined to do, and that is overturn precedent. If they overturn that precedent, that will be another step in favor of a move towards unitary executive theory. The idea that the president must have complete control of their branch of government in order for our system of separation of powers and checks and balances to work. Again, that's just according to one theory. You don't have to agree with that, and it's not clear what the Supreme Court will decide. But that is the reason that I have forced you to sit here looking at that slide and listening to me talk about it for so long. Now, not all of the bureaucracy is made up of civil servants. Some of it is political appointees. Now, to be clear, political appointees are still people too. There aren't very many of them. There's about 500 political appointees. These people are what's known as, these people hold jobs that are listed in what is known as the Plum Book. And I don't actually know that the book is plum colored, but that's not what it's about anyway. It refers to plum jobs. Okay? You might hear somebody say, man, I wish I'd gotten that guy's job is a plum gig. Okay? Meaning that these are like plums. They are nice things to have. They are given by the president to people as rewards for their service or past support. And if that sounds like patronage, in that case, it is. And for political appointees, that's okay. Right? It's a relatively small number of positions. And when we talk about them being appointed, in this case, I do mean appointed directly by the president. One of the best examples of people that have one of these small number of plum book jobs are ambassadors. If you want to be the ambassador to some really nice, comfortable European country with lots of culture and amenities, give a lot of money to a presidential campaign. That has been historically one of the best paths to being appointed to one of these plum gig ambassadorships. So do understand that we've got political appointees in the mix. And now that we know that two types of people in bureaucracy, the civil servants and the political appointees. We need to really think about them as two different kinds of bureaucrats. And for political appointees, we might be talking about what Hecklow in 1977 referred to as the government of strangers. They're transient. They're appointed by one president. They are very likely to be replaced by the next president. So you might have been ambassador in a really great place, but you may only be there for 4 years, 8 years at the outside, because the next president is probably going to come in and replace you with their own pick. But it's not just ambassadors. It could be a variety of appointed positions, cabinet level departments, other executive agencies. So these people are transient. They're not around for a long time. On the other hand, you have the civil servants that we've already talked about, the meritocrats. These people can have decades-long careers. They are the ones who are deeply embedded in the specialization, the impersonal side of the bureaucracy, the hierarchy of the bureaucracy in detail. These might be people that are referred to as the deep state. Now, in the United States, I want to be clear, when you hear the term deep state, you are very often hearing somebody talk about a conspiracy theory of the deep state that is there to thwart presidents from thwart the policy goals of presidents. In other contexts, we talk about people that have had long careers in the civil service, and they're often collectively referred to in Britain as mandarins, which is a reference to the Mandarin, the bureaucracy in China, dating back a very long time. These are the highly educated people tasked with running the government. They might also be called Whitehall in the UK. They're not always referred to in such anodyne terms. They are referred to quite negatively by the Conservative Party or Tories in the UK as the blob. Before we get to that. So, in thinking about this, just to help you kind of understand it in more of that comparative perspective. This is from a show that I really enjoy. It is called Yes Minister. It had a sequel, Yes Prime Minister. And it was all about the interactions between elected officials. If it were here, it could have been political appointees who are transient in their jobs, interacting with the career civil servants who have been in those bureaucracies for a long time. So you can see the negative side of this. This show has given rise to an untold number of memes. And the idea here is that the civil service is there, right, to keep the politicians from running wild with the government and making dramatic changes. One of the lines that often comes up in that show is, the civil service made this country what it is, which, if you take it on face value, sounds like a bureaucrat bragging about the great things the civil service has accomplished. That also, because this show, Yes Minister, is satire, is meant to get people to think of what came about in the United Kingdom shortly before this show was launched in, I believe, 1980. And one of those events that preceded this show, not by very many years, was the Winter of Discontent in Britain. You had violent labor movements clashing with police. You had public service strikes where trash piled up higher and higher in the streets, and lots of services stopped because the civil servants have stopped doing their jobs. So, again, there's kind of this, can be this cynical view that the civil service often causes a lot of problems and may cause, in some cases, more problems than it solves. But the non-cynical view, getting away from ideas like the deep state in the United States or the blob in the United Kingdom, is that having a civil service based on meritocracy, based on a standard of being apolitical and also insulated from political firings, is that we have a bureaucracy that is staffed by long-serving experts who provide policy continuity from one administration to the next. Our next topic is going to be control of the bureaucracy, because sometimes political officials certainly push back against the idea that the civil service should stop them from governing the country the way they want to. And we're going to talk about 3 different means of controlling the bureaucracy in big picture based on the 3 different branches. So we're first going to talk about legislative control of the bureaucracy. And keep in perspective as we're talking about this, the bureaucracy is always part of the executive branch. So some of this is going to be talking about systems of checks and balances. So we'll first talk about legislative control of the bureaucracy, and Congress has a variety of ways of doing this. So one, it can shape the bureaucracy by influencing who runs it. So for those high-ranking political appointees that require Senate confirmation, if the Senate is opposed to these people, it can block their confirmation. And that doesn't happen very often, but it is a tool that the legislature has. Congress also has the oversight function that we've previously discussed, holding committee hearings where members of the executive branch are called before Congress to give reports and answer sometimes very tough, very heated questions. And I mean, this is an example, just of a screenshot of a time that current Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was called before Congress to give testimony and answer questions. As a result of oversight, Congress can modify the budgets of the bureaucracy. That could be increasing their budgets if they think that that part of the bureaucracy has been doing a good job and needs more resources. On the other hand, if Congress thinks that an agency has gone rogue or is not being effective, it can reduce the budget for that agency. Okay, so it's got a carrot and a stick, right, in the oversight process. Congress also, of course, as the legislative branch, has a legislative tool, and that is to pass bills that change the legislative policy the bureaucracy carries out, or at least clarifies that policy. Right? If you could get Congress around to it, they could clarify the policy around COBRA health insurance benefits in a way that might make them less expensive to people who are between jobs with employee-based health coverage or health insurance. So, as you're thinking about that, think back to the COBRA example, write COBRA here in your notes so that you can tie those 2 things together. Of course, the executive has control over parts of the executive. And the president, when we talk about control of the bureaucracy, we're largely talking about the president wanting to exert their control over the bureaucracy that makes up their branch of government. Presidents, like Congress, can influence the bureaucracy by picking the people who will run different parts of it. In the case of the president, that's by appointing the people they want. These would be some of those roughly 500 political appointees that we've talked about previously. The president can also instruct the bureaucracy to do things using executive orders. The president also has the power to change the budget of a bureaucracy when it makes its annual budget proposals. And you guys have been able to see this in recent news, where the president proposes sometimes much larger budgets for example, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, while proposing deeply slashed, or in some cases, abolished budgets for parts of the bureaucracy that the executive branch would prefer not be active at all. Now, that, however, is not easy to do because the president can propose their budget, but Congress has to pass that budget. And so the Congress may say no to funding increases or no to budget cuts. One of the examples we will see has to do with military spending or defense spending. And in those cases, what the executive branch often finds is that Congress simply will not go along to executive branch efforts to control defense spending or to shift defense spending in new directions. So I want to be clear that that can be a major way of the president shaping the bureaucracy, but doing so through budget proposals is difficult. It's certainly not a sure thing. The president can also use reorganization of the bureaucracy. They have some ability to shuffle things around, combine things. I mean, one of the examples of this we saw earlier, but it still works here, is President Nixon's transformation of the Bureau of Budget into the Office of Management and Budget within the executive branch. But again, that's not always easy. If parts of the bureaucracy were explicitly created by Congress to exist in certain ways and do certain things, the president cannot just combine or get rid of parts of the bureaucracy as the president sees fit. So again, we have that example of the Bureau of Budget to the Office of Management Budget. Lately, there has also been this possibility that the president can shape the bureaucracy by firing staff. And I don't just mean staff in high-level positions, but mass firings throughout a bureaucracy, throughout a particular agency, for example, or ordering the people who work in that agency to cease to do their jobs. The example of that, at least to this point, still in effect, is the shutting down of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB. I would write that down. I've got the abbreviation here, but Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where at the time that DOGE was operational, early in Trump's second administration, there were mass layoffs, and people who were still working within the Bureau were ordered to stop doing their jobs. We'll see how that stands the test of time and court cases, but that looks like, for now, a possible way that the president can dramatically affect and control the bureaucracy. There are also judicial tools for controlling the bureaucracy. As I told you, we talk about all three branches and their means of controlling this part of the executive branch. One of those we've already seen through judicial review, way back to our diagram of separation of powers and checks and balances. We've seen that the Supreme Court, that the federal courts, not just the Supreme Court, can use their judicial review power to declare bureaucratic rules, regulations, actions to be unconstitutional, and order those regulations to be rescinded, repealed, or for whatever that bureaucratic action is to stop. However, until recently, the federal courts, up to the level of the Supreme Court, gave bureaucracies a lot of room to act and to make rules and regulations. This was known as the Chevron deference. It came out of a case from 1984, Chevron USA Inc. versus the National Resources Defense Council, which is an environmentalist interest group. Chevron, if you're not familiar, is a large American oil company. It's often referred to as one of our oil majors, along with, say, ExxonMobil, for example. And for us, what's important about this case is not the background. In this case, we very much care specifically about the ruling. And the ruling in this case established a two-step process, two-step test for courts when deciding whether or not to intervene to rule against a regulation or bureaucratic action. So the first step was to ask the question, has Congress directly addressed the precise issue of that particular bureaucratic action or regulation? If the answer is yes, then the court must rule that the agency must follow the legislative intent as Congress, because Congress directly addressed the precise issue in the legislation. So if there is that precision in the legislation, then the court can interpret the legislation and follow it and order the agency to follow Congress's intent. However, if Congress was not clear and precise in directly addressing the issue at question, then you move to step 2. And that is to ask if the agency's interpretation is reasonable. If the court finds that the agency's interpretation of legislative policy is reasonable, whether that interpretation is in terms of making a rule or regulation or enforcing something through bureaucratic action, then the court must defer to that reasonable interpretation, right, even if the court would have interpreted the statute itself, right, the legislation, the law itself, differently. And I know that's a lot to write down. Usually I don't put as much on the slide, but in this case, you need to understand the 2-step test that was established by the Supreme Court in that case. Partly so that you can understand now things are different. The Supreme Court has kind of changed tack, and the federal courts now must exercise their own judgment. Courts are not permitted to defer to an agency's interpretation just because that agency's interpretation is reasonable. So the Chevron deference test is out. The courts have to interpret the statute and then interpret whether the agency's action is in line with their interpretation of the statute or law. And that is a result of this case, Loper Bright versus Raimondo in 2024, which, as I said, overturned Chevron USA Inc. versus National Resources Defense Council, and ended Chevron deference. And if this all sounds obscure and arcane and the only kind of thing, only the kind of thing a political scientist could want to talk about or even know about, just understand, this Chevron deference was a big deal, whether you were for or against it. It made it into the mainstream through political cartoons. And this one being a negative view of Chevron deference, where we have the tree that is the United States government with its 3 branches, judicial, legislative, executive, but growing out of that executive is the body of federal agencies, right, extending and getting bigger because of the deference as a result of the Chevron ruling in 1984. Based on that ruling, the court had given bureaucracies a very long leash and a wide berth, to mix metaphors, to act and make rules. Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo turns that around, and puts the power of interpretation squarely in the hands of the courts, and the responsibility for it. Not just the power, but federal courts now are not permitted to defer, right? They have to make their own independent judgment. And so these are 2 Supreme Court cases that, even if they're not on anybody's official list for you to know, you should know these. From there, we're going to continue looking at trends in the bureaucracy.